Deep in the forests of northern Michigan, hidden beneath the canopy, lies one of the strangest unsolved mysteries in North American history. If I told you ancient miners were extracting copper here on a massive scale, thousands of years before the Great Pyramids were built in Egypt, you'd probably think I'm exaggerating. But in the 1800s, settlers and mining crews found thousands of old pits and heavy stone hammers, some close to 30 pounds, scattered across places like Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula. The target was Native American copper, shockingly pure, often workable without smelting. And here's the problem. The landscape suggests an enormous amount was taken, yet museums hold only a small fraction in tools and trinkets. So where did the rest go? Traded away? Used up? Lost to time? Or carried somewhere nobody expects? Welcome to the mystery of America's lost copper. And before we begin our journey, I'd love to know where you are joining us from tonight and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to read through the comments and see how far these stories travel across the world, so let me know below. It's the 1840s. American miners are pushing into the forests of the Great Lakes, clearing trees, cutting rough roads, chasing rumors of copper with the kind of urgency that makes people sleep cold and work anyway. But then the ground starts telling a different story, not a folk tale, not a campfire rumor, something blunt and physical. Pits in the earth, trenches, piles of waste stone that don't look natural once you really look at them. These aren't the clean, straight cuts you'd expect from later industrial equipment. They're uneven, practical, and repeated, spread across the landscape like the leftovers of a job done over and over. When miners and surveyors began to notice them, especially around Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula and on Isle Royale, they started finding tools too. Not iron, not steel, stone. Hammerstones, heavy mauls, battered cobbles with edges bruised from thousands of strikes, sometimes once tied to wooden handles that have long since disappeared. Some of these stones are big enough that you can't pretend it was casual work, weights that can climb toward 30 pounds. You pick one up and your first thought isn't artifact, it's effort. This was labor that had to be organized and repeated, because a single person swinging a stone like that all day doesn't get far unless other people are helping, hauling, clearing, and keeping the work moving. And the more people looked, the more the scale came into focus. These weren't a few curious holes. There were thousands of pits, many softened by time, refilled by soil, hidden under moss and leaf litter, but still there. In some places, you can trace a line of work along a ridge, as if crews opened one spot, then the next, following the copper where it showed itself and shifting when it dipped away. The piles of discarded stone can be enormous, evidence that whoever did this wasn't just picking up what was lying loose. They were digging, prying, cracking, sorting, and carrying rock out of the way to reach the metal. The obvious question is why anyone would do this with stone hammers in a northern landscape that freezes hard for a metal that, at first glance, seems like it would require furnaces, smelting, and a whole industrial setup. That's where the geology flips the story. Up here, copper doesn't always behave like it does in the standard ore and furnace narrative. In many parts of the world, copper is bound up in minerals that have to be chemically separated. You crush the rock, you heat it, you refine it. But the Lake Superior region is famous for something different: native copper, metal that occurs as metal in the ground, sometimes in veins, sometimes in nodules, sometimes in heavy masses lodged inside volcanic rock. It can be remarkably pure compared to typical copper ores, and that changes what's possible. It doesn't make the work easy, but it makes it workable. If copper is already present as metal in bedrock, a determined group with time can extract it without a full smelting industry. They can use fire setting to crack rock, heating a face, then shocking it so it fractures, then attack those fractures with stone, pry out the copper, and carry it off in pieces. And once you have the metal out, the next challenge is turning it into something useful without ruining it. Copper can be hammered into shape, but it hardens as you work it, and if you push it too far, it can split. The skilled solution is a simple cycle learned through experience. Hammer to shape, then heat and cool to soften it again, then hammer more. That heat treatment, annealing, doesn't melt copper, it resets it, so the metal stays tough instead of cracking. It's a practical craft trick, but it's also a clue about mindset. People weren't just grabbing metal, they were learning how to manage it. So when those 19th century crews found battered stone tools scattered around old pits, they weren't looking at ceremonial props or a few random holes. They were looking at the footprint of a mining operation that had been forgotten by most of the country, but not by the ground. These sites sit there quietly, waiting for someone to notice what the landscape is saying. This place was worked intensely and repeatedly, long before modern mining arrived. And once that sinks in, one question starts to press harder than the rest. If so many pits were opened, if so much rock was moved, then how much copper did they actually take out of this place? Once you accept that those pits are real mines, the next thing that happens is almost automatic. People start trying to count what came out of the ground. Not because everyone loves numbers, but because the landscape itself feels like it's demanding a scale. You see the repeated excavations, the long trenches, the waste rock that had to be moved by hand, and your brain says, okay, this wasn't a little side project. So researchers and historians have tried to estimate the total production, and the range they land on is big enough to make anyone pause. Depending on how you count pits, how you interpret waste piles, how deep you assume the miners went, and how you translate disturbed rock into recovered metal, estimates can run from roughly 500 million pounds of copper to something like 1.5 billion pounds. That's not a tight, confident figure, and it shouldn't be, because we're working with a record that was never meant to be a spreadsheet. Some pits collapsed and refilled, some were reused, some are still hidden under forest soil, and the copper itself wasn't extracted in neat, standardized blocks the way a modern company would measure it. Still, even the lower end of those estimates suggests a massive amount of metal. And that's where the story hits its nerve. If hundreds of millions of pounds or more were pulled from this region, you'd expect the continent to be crowded with that copper in obvious ways. You'd expect museum storerooms to groan under it, for collections to have stacks of tools and ornaments that feel almost industrial in quantity, for famous hoards to be common. Instead, what you find is something more frustrating and more interesting. Museums do have copper, awls, points, knives, beads, pendants, rolled sheets, sometimes pieces that look surprisingly modern in their clean practicality. You can see that people knew what they were doing. You can see wear, repair, reworking. But you don't see anything that feels like billions of pounds. Even if you add up what's displayed, what's stored, what's been recorded in reports, and what sits in private hands, there's still a sense of mismatch. It's not that the artifacts are absent, it's that the visible quantity doesn't match the implied effort. And that gap is exactly the kind of gap that breeds wild explanations. When people feel a mismatch between what they think should exist and what they can point to, they reach for dramatic solutions: a stolen treasure, a secret export route, a lost stockpile waiting to be discovered. Those ideas feel satisfying because they turn a slow problem into a fast story. But there's another way to look at the same mismatch that's less exciting at first and much harder to dismiss once you sit with it. Not in museums doesn't mean never existed. Museums are not a complete inventory of the past. They are a thin sample shaped by what survives, what gets found, what gets reported, what gets preserved, and what someone decides is worth collecting. A copper tool used hard for years might end its life as a small fragment nobody recognizes, or get reshaped into something else, or corrode into a brittle mineral skin that doesn't look like a tool anymore. A copper object buried in the wrong soil might leave behind a stain and a trace instead of a clean artifact. And a huge amount of copper, if it moved through everyday hands for a very long time, could disperse into thousands of small objects that were constantly recycled, traded onward, repaired, and eventually lost. The problem is that you can't feel that dispersal just by standing in a gallery. A gallery shows you highlights, not the long, quiet grind of use. So the mystery sharpens into a more precise question. It's not only how much copper was mined, and it's not only where is the pile. The real question is what kind of system could take an enormous flow of copper and turn it into a scattered pattern that's hard to see from the modern viewpoint. If the numbers are even partly right, then the copper didn't simply disappear. It changed form. It traveled, it wore down, it sank into places we don't automatically look. And until we understand that system, the pits remain unsettling because they look like the beginning of an industrial story, while the evidence we can easily point to looks, at first glance, too small for the job. Before the mystery runs away with us, it helps to slow down and ask a plain question that keeps honest stories honest. What are we actually sure about, and how do we know it? Because it's true, you can't take a chunk of copper or a stone hammer and run a radiocarbon test on it. Radiocarbon dating works on once living things: wood, bone, charcoal, plant fibers. Stone and metal don't carry that kind of clock. So when archaeologists talk about ancient mining in the Great Lakes, the dates aren't pulled from the copper itself. They're built from context, from the things that were used with the mining, the traces left by the work, and the materials that got trapped in the layers around it. Think of it like a crime scene where the weapon has no fingerprints, but everything around it does. One of the most useful clues comes from how people break rock when they don't have explosives. A common technique is fire setting. You heat the rock face with a fire, then cool it quickly so it cracks. Fires leave charcoal. Charcoal is organic. Charcoal can be radiocarbon dated. When charcoal is found in the right place, embedded in mining debris layers, sealed under later sediments, clearly tied to rock-breaking activity, it becomes a timestamp for work at that spot. It doesn't tell you every year the mine was used, but it gives you anchors, points in time when people were actively cracking rock. Another kind of clue comes from the pits themselves. Many of these excavations filled in slowly after they were abandoned. Soil and plant material drift in, sediments wash down, layers build up like pages in a book. Organic material trapped in those layers can also be dated. That helps bracket the activity. If a pit began filling at a certain time, mining likely ended before that. If the oldest fill is a certain age, the pit had to exist before it started collecting that material. It's not a single clean number, but multiple boundaries that narrow the window. And then there's the most visually striking kind of evidence, the one that feels almost like a gift from chemistry, organic material that survives because it was in contact with copper. Copper is naturally hostile to many microbes. It's one reason copper surfaces have a reputation for being antimicrobial. In archaeological settings, that same property can slow bacterial breakdown or help preserve traces that would normally vanish fast. Sometimes it's a wood fragment from a handle that stayed attached to a copper tool. Sometimes it's plant fiber cordage that once lashed a stone hammer or secured a copper piece and left an impression or mineralized residue. Sometimes it's not a perfect preserved handle, but enough material to identify, sample, and date. When that organic material is clearly part of the tool or directly associated with it, radiocarbon dating can give a strong clue for when that object was made or used. It's not that copper magically freezes everything in time, and it doesn't work the same way in every soil. But the cases where it does work are powerful because they let you date the human touch rather than the metal itself. There are also cross-checks that don't rely on radiocarbon alone. Copper objects appear in sites that have their own stratigraphy, layers of occupation that can be dated through multiple lines of evidence. If copper tools and ornaments consistently show up in contexts associated with certain cultural periods, certain pottery styles, certain burial traditions, and those contexts have independently dated material, that becomes another support beam under the timeline. You're not dating copper directly, but you're building a consistent picture from many sites and many kinds of evidence, and consistency matters. If the mining and working were late, you'd expect copper artifacts to cluster in late layers. If they were early, you'd expect them to appear in earlier contexts. Over time, that pattern becomes hard to ignore. All of this comes with limits, and it's important to say that out loud, because the limits are part of the strength. The dates often come in ranges, not single years. Some mining sites are well studied, and others are poorly documented. Early excavations weren't always careful by modern standards, and some evidence was lost or removed without good records. Even radiocarbon dates need interpretation. You have to be sure the charcoal you date is actually from the mining activity and not from a later campfire someone built nearby. That's why archaeologists prefer samples that are sealed in place, trapped under undisturbed layers, or physically tied to the mining process. The goal isn't to win an argument with one perfect test. The goal is to build a timeline that holds up under pressure. And when you do that, what emerges is not a story of a single event, but a long span of activity, with mining and copper working happening in the region thousands of years before industrial mining. That timeline matters because it sets the terms of the mystery. If the copper extraction was ancient, then the missing copper can't be explained by modern theft or a recent export scheme. It has to be explained by what people on the continent were doing with copper over long stretches of time, how they used it, how they moved it, how they valued it, and how material can slowly vanish from the places we expect to find it, while still leaving an undeniable footprint in the earth. When people hear hundreds of millions of pounds of copper, and then they don't see mountains of it in collections, their minds reach for a shortcut. Someone must have taken it. And the names that show up in that shortcut are almost always the same: Minoans, Phoenicians, sometimes a vague Mediterranean traders, and sometimes the word Atlantis gets tossed in like a final flourish. The idea has a simple appeal. It turns a slow, messy problem into a clean story with a clear culprit and a clear destination. And it lets the missing copper feel like a single dramatic event instead of centuries of ordinary life. But when you treat it as a historical claim, it runs into a basic issue. Big operations leave big, repeatable traces, and the kind of long-term foreign mining and shipping project this theory implies would almost certainly leave evidence that looks foreign in the places where the work supposedly happened. If groups from the Bronze Age Mediterranean were coming to the Keweenaw or Isle Royale repeatedly, moving serious amounts of copper, you'd expect more than just the copper itself. You'd expect a trail of material culture that doesn't blend in: ceramics and recognizable styles, metal items with old-world manufacturing signatures, ship-related hardware, tools, ornaments, inscriptions, or burials that look out of place. You'd also expect signs of sustained camps and support activity, because a workforce can't run on mystery. People would be cooking, repairing gear, storing supplies, losing objects, burying their dead, leaving broken pottery and everyday trash in the dirt. Archaeologists have worked these regions for a long time, and in the core mining areas, the kind of consistent, clearly Mediterranean artifact layer you'd expect from repeated foreign presence simply hasn't turned up. Supporters of the theory sometimes respond with, well, maybe they cleaned up after themselves. But that's not how archaeology usually works. Even careful groups lose things. Storms happen, fires happen, camps get abandoned in a hurry, stuff breaks. A single season of sustained work tends to leave a footprint, and multiple seasons over many years tend to leave a footprint you can recognize. There's also the biological side, which needs to be handled carefully because genetics isn't a magic wand, but it's still relevant. If there had been repeated contact and a working presence large enough to extract and move enormous quantities of copper, many researchers would expect at least some kind of signal, either in well-studied human remains or in the broader pattern of settlements and material exchange that points to outsiders staying long enough to matter. Instead, the evidence we do have lines up better with indigenous communities using and moving copper within North America, not with a foreign industrial pipeline appearing and vanishing without clear residue. And then there's plain logistics. Moving bulk metal is hard even with roads and pack animals. Now imagine moving it from inland mines through wilderness to a coast, loading it, crossing an ocean, unloading it, and doing that repeatedly at scales that would make a real dent in those missing millions estimates. It's not that humans can't do hard logistics, it's that hard logistics usually leaves documentation in some form: material debris, ports, wrecks, trade goods moving the other direction in noticeable amounts, or at least consistent archaeological signatures at both ends. A transoceanic copper supply line large enough to feed Bronze Age Europe would likely show up not just in stories, but in patterns. You'd expect North American copper to be identifiable in European contexts in a way that convinces most specialists, and you'd expect the mining zones to show traces of the outside presence that made the extraction possible. The problem is that the claim requires a huge, sustained activity, while the evidence offered for it tends to be thin, scattered, or argued from absence. That's why this theory is best understood as a narrative trap. It feels satisfying because it answers the emotional question, where did it go, by pointing a finger across an ocean, but it also quietly does something else. It pulls attention away from the people who were actually living on the continent and actually interacting with this material over long periods. If the mines are real and the dates are ancient, then the most reasonable default isn't an invisible foreign industry that left almost no fingerprints. The more reasonable default is that the copper stayed in North America, moving through networks we're only beginning to appreciate, being worked by craftspeople who understood the metal well enough to keep using it, reshaping it, and passing it along. Once you let that possibility sit in your mind, the flashy explanations start to feel less like bold solutions and more like a way of avoiding the harder, more interesting truth. The story might be big without needing outsiders to make it big. If you want to understand why the copper story is so hard to explain with simple stereotypes, you have to spend time with the objects themselves. Not just the prettiest pieces, not just the beads and pendants, but the tools that look like they were meant to be held until they wore down. When archaeologists talk about early copper working around the Great Lakes, you'll often hear the term Old Copper Complex. It's a convenient label for a very long tradition, but the important part is what it implies. This wasn't a one-time discovery where people stumbled on metal and made a few lucky experiments. It was a sustained craft with repeatable methods carried across generations. And the core method is easy to describe and hard to master. Copper can be shaped by hammering, but as you work it, it work hardens. The more you strike it, the stiffer it becomes. Push too far, and thin sections begin to crack. So the craft isn't just hitting copper, it's knowing when to stop hitting it. The solution is annealing. Heat the copper until it relaxes, then cool it, then return to hammering. That cycle, hammer, heat, cool, hammer, lets you thin a sheet, draw out a point, or shape a cutting edge without the metal tearing itself apart. It's the difference between making a dent and making a tool. It's also a kind of material knowledge that you don't get from a single afternoon. You get it from repeated failure and careful observation, and from people comparing results and teaching each other what works. You can see that learning in the forms that show up again and again. Awls made to pierce hide and bark, points shaped for hunting or fishing, knives that were maintained through sharpening, pieces that have been reworked until they look like they lived several lives. A lot of copper objects from this tradition aren't huge and flashy. They're practical. They're sized to be carried. They're shaped to be used. And that's part of the clue. If you have a material that takes real labor to extract and real skill to work, you tend to use it in ways that justify the cost. That doesn't always mean luxury. Sometimes it means reliability. A copper awl can be a serious upgrade when you're making clothing, nets, containers, and shelters, because piercing and sewing are everywhere in daily life. A copper point can be resharpened and maintained. A copper knife can be kept working long after a brittle stone edge would have snapped. The craft becomes valuable not because copper is shiny, but because copper is serviceable and, when you know what you're doing, surprisingly resilient. There's also a social dimension that's easy to miss if you only look at the finished products. To produce copper tools at scale, you need a chain of steps that doesn't happen in isolation. Somebody has to locate the metal and free it from rock. Somebody has to transport it. Somebody has to do the controlled working. And somebody has to know enough to avoid wasting it. That implies routines and roles. It implies that knowledge wasn't random and personal. It was shared, kept alive, and improved. Even the wear on stone hammers and anvil stones tells you something. These weren't ceremonial stones placed carefully and left untouched. They were used up. They carry impact scars, edge damage, and the kind of battered surfaces that come from being part of a production rhythm. That rhythm is the real marker of skill. And it's worth pausing on what skill means here, because it's not just about shaping metal into a pleasing outline, it's about control. Imagine trying to draw out a long, thin point without modern tongs, without modern temperature gauges, without a metal anvil. using stone and wood and your own senses. You have to judge when the copper has hardened too much. You have to judge how hot is hot enough to soften it without ruining it. You have to know how to cool it and how to return to the hammering in the right sequence. You also have to plan the shape because every strike moves metal, and once a piece cracks badly, you can't just press a reset button. Many researchers interpret the consistency of forms and the repeated presence of annealing signatures as evidence that these weren't isolated acts. They were techniques embedded in communities. And just like with any craft tradition, that means people were probably specializing, at least to some degree, not in the modern sense of a full-time factory worker, but in the sense that some individuals would have been better at this than others, more experienced, more trusted, more sought out. In a world where time is precious, you don't hand your best copper to someone who's guessing. You hand it to someone who's proven they can turn it into something that lasts. This is also where the old assumption about primitive technology starts to fall apart. The absence of smelting doesn't mean the absence of engineering. The engineering is simply aimed at different problems: cracking rock, managing heat for annealing, shaping with stone tools, maintaining edges, reducing waste, and making objects that can be repaired and reused. That's practical intelligence applied to a specific environment. And it helps explain why the mines don't feel like an accident. If you have craftspeople who know how to transform copper reliably, then copper mining stops being a curiosity and becomes a serious investment. You can justify the hard work because the output is real. Tools that help you make other tools, objects that carry value in trade, items that can mark status or identity, and materials that can be stored and worked later. So when we talk about masters here, it isn't a romantic compliment. It's a description of a tradition that learned how to handle a tricky material and built a stable method around it. The copper wasn't just dug up, it was managed, it was disciplined, it was made to behave. And once you see that, the next step becomes almost inevitable. If this kind of metalworking existed and mattered, then copper wouldn't sit quietly near its source forever. It would start traveling, not as a mystery export to another continent, but as part of the continent's own web of exchange. Once copper becomes something people can reliably work, something they can shape, repair, and trust, it stops being just a local resource and starts behaving like a social resource. It moves. And it moves in a way that can look invisible from a modern distance because we're used to thinking of trade as big ships, big ports, and written contracts. A lot of ancient trade is quieter than that. It's relational. It runs on repeated contact, on marriage ties, on seasonal gatherings, on gift-giving, on obligations, on trust built over time. Objects travel because people travel, and because people know other people. In North America, there's strong evidence that long-distance exchange networks existed across huge areas for thousands of years, and copper from the Great Lakes becomes one of the clearest threads you can follow through that web. The geography helps. The Great Lakes region isn't an isolated island of resources. It's tied into water routes that connect to major river systems. Water is the easiest highway when you're carrying heavy material. A person can haul only so much overland, but a canoe can carry real weight, and a chain of rivers can move objects farther than a single group might ever walk in one stretch. So copper can travel in steps, lake to river, river to another river, from one community to the next, sometimes moving as raw pieces, sometimes as partially worked blanks, sometimes as finished objects that carry both use and meaning. And the evidence for that movement shows up in a simple, stubborn way. Copper objects appear in places where local geology doesn't offer that kind of native copper. When archaeologists find Great Lakes copper artifacts far from the source, it's hard to explain without trade or travel. The distribution is wide enough that it forces you to picture a continent in motion, not a patchwork of isolated pockets. Over time, later exchange systems associated with cultures archaeologists call Edina and Hopewell become famous for their reach, with materials like shells, obsidian, mica, and copper moving through the interior. Copper becomes part of that story not as a single cargo, but as a material that people valued in different ways. In some contexts, it's practical: tools, awls, points, cutting edges. In other contexts, it's symbolic: ornaments, plates, beads, items placed in burials or ceremonial deposits. And that variety matters because it helps explain why copper doesn't show up today as one giant pile. A distributed system doesn't concentrate mass, it spreads it thin across space and time. Another point that tends to surprise people is how little of this needs to be mass export to add up. If copper moves steadily for centuries, even small flows become large totals. A few pounds here, a few pounds there, carried in a canoe, carried on foot, passed at gatherings, traded for food, hides, stone, pigments. Over generations, the cumulative movement becomes enormous. That's how a landscape can show evidence of heavy extraction, while modern observers struggle to locate the output in a single place. The output wasn't meant to be stored as wealth in a warehouse. It was meant to circulate. It was meant to become useful things and meaningful things. It was meant to be used. And used is the key word that turns the missing copper mystery into something more realistic. Copper tools don't stay the same forever. An awl wears down, gets sharpened, gets shortened. A point breaks, gets reworked. A knife edge gets ground and reground. A sheet gets cut into smaller pieces. A damaged ornament can be reshaped. A lump kept in storage can be hammered into something else years later. In a culture that understands annealing and cold working, copper is not a one-shot material. It's a material you can keep returning to. That means copper is constantly being transformed, and transformation is a kind of disappearance if you're expecting to find the original form. It also means copper objects can be passed through many hands across long distances without ever leaving a dramatic archaeological pile. There's a human side to this too. Trade networks aren't just economic maps, they're social systems. A copper ornament might signal affiliation. A copper piece might be a diplomatic gift. A tool made from distant metal might carry prestige because it connects you to far places and far relationships. And once copper carries that kind of social meaning, it becomes even more likely to travel. People carry meaningful objects with them. They place them in burials. They offer them at important moments. They keep them as heirlooms, and then, eventually, they lose them, or they bury them, or they pass them on until nobody remembers where the metal originally came from. That's why a continental web is such a powerful explanation. It doesn't ask you to believe in a single dramatic event. It asks you to picture a living continent with corridors of movement, rivers, lakes, trails, gatherings, where materials flow as a natural consequence of human connection. Copper from the Great Lakes showing up in places like the Southeast, the Plains, the lower Mississippi region, and the Ohio Valley isn't a weird anomaly in that picture. It's what you'd expect if people were curious, mobile, and socially linked across distance. And once you accept that copper was circulating like this, used, repaired, reshaped, traded onward, you're ready for the final step, which isn't really about trade at all. It's about what time and soil do to copper, and how a material can be everywhere in a dispersed sense while still feeling missing when you go looking for it in the most obvious places. So if the copper moved across a continent and passed through countless hands, the last question isn't really who took it, it's what happens to a material after it's been in use for centuries. Because metals don't behave like museum pieces in real life, they behave like tools and objects have life cycles. Start with the simplest part, wear. A copper owl isn't a statue, it's a working point that punches through hide, bark, plant fiber, maybe even thin wood. Every puncture dulls it a little, so it gets sharpened. Sharpening removes metal. Over years, a long owl becomes a shorter owl, then a stub, then maybe it gets reforged into something else, or it gets thrown away because it's not worth saving anymore. The same with points and blades. Edges are maintained by grinding and hammering. Tips break, pieces get bent and straightened. Every repair costs material, and the cost often ends up as tiny particles, copper dust, flakes, microscopic fragments that no one in the moment treats as important, but that adds up across generations. Now add recycling, which is easy to underestimate if you're used to thinking of ancient people as wasteful. If you have a craft tradition that understands how to rework copper, especially if you know annealing, you don't discard metal just because an object is damaged, you reshape it. A broken point can become a smaller point. A worn knife can become an owl. A bent ornament can be hammered into a new form. Even small scraps can be gathered and worked into beads or thin sheets. In a world where copper takes labor to mine and labor to shape, reusing it is the rational choice. The result is that copper doesn't pile up as old junk. It stays in circulation, shrinking and changing form as it goes. That alone can explain why so much mining effort produces so few dramatic leftovers. The copper didn't vanish, it got spent. Then there's loss, which sounds trivial until you remember how long we're talking about. Objects fall out of pockets, tools drop into water, a canoe tips, a camp moves, someone dies far from home, a storm erases a shoreline, a river changes course. A small copper piece lost in leaf litter is hard to find even a week later. Multiply that by centuries, and you get a steady drip of copper into places that archaeology rarely samples well. Marshes, riverbeds, lake shallows, forests that were never excavated, sites that were destroyed before anyone knew they mattered. A lot of the missing copper is probably sitting in exactly those places, real, physical, but scattered. Burial practices and ceremonial deposits matter too, and not just because they create museum artifacts. In many regions, copper appears in mounds and burials, often as items that were meant to stay with the dead or be offered to the earth. Those deposits can preserve copper, but they can also hide it permanently. Not every mound has been excavated. Many are protected, unstudied, or simply unknown. Others were excavated long ago with poor documentation. Some were looted. Some were flattened for farming or development before anyone recorded what was inside. So even when copper was intentionally placed in concentrated contexts, modern visibility is uneven. A small number of well-studied sites can give the impression that copper is rare, when in fact the record is full of blind spots. And then there's chemistry, which is the part people find hardest to accept, because we're used to thinking of metal as permanent. Copper can last a very long time, but it doesn't always survive as a clean object. In many soils, copper corrodes. It forms mineral compounds. It can turn into a crust that preserves the outline of an object, or it can break down into brittle fragments, or it can leach and stain the surrounding sediment. Thin copper is especially vulnerable. A delicate sheet or a small bead can become a greenish trace and then, over enough time in the wrong conditions, become hard to recognize as an artifact at all. Even when the copper is still there chemically, it may not be there as something a person can pick up and say, "This is a tool." So part of the missing copper feeling is a mismatch between modern expectations and what preservation actually allows. We imagine copper like a pile of coins that should still be shiny and countable. But most ancient copper lived as working material, exposed to sweat, fire, water, soil, stress, and time. Another subtle factor is how archaeology itself filters what we see. Archaeological recovery is uneven across the continent. Some regions have been surveyed heavily, others haven't. Some sites are easy to detect, others are buried deep or covered by later activity. Many copper objects are small, many are plain, many could be missed in older excavations, and even today, what gets recovered depends on methods, funding, and chance. That's not a flaw, it's just the reality of sampling a past that left no centralized archive. When you put all of this together, the mystery begins to feel less like a vanishing act and more like a normal outcome of long-term use. A huge amount of copper can be mined over a long period and still fail to show up as a huge, obvious stockpile today because the copper didn't behave like treasure. It behaved like material. It was worked into tools and ornaments, repaired and reshaped, traded outward, lost in countless small accidents, placed into the ground deliberately in burials and offerings, and transformed by chemistry into forms that are harder to recognize. The missing copper is not gone in one direction, it's dispersed in 1,000 directions. And that dispersal is actually consistent with the strongest evidence we have. The pits suggest sustained extraction, the artifacts suggest skilled working, and the wide distribution suggests movement across communities. The last piece is simply accepting what time does to a useful material in a living world. Once you accept that, the story stops asking for a single dramatic answer. It asks for a continent-scale perspective, where did it go becomes how did people live with it? And the answer is, they used it up, little by little, until the copper became less a pile you can point to, and more a quiet trace woven into the soil and history of an entire region. In the end, the most unsettling thing about these old copper mines isn't that they exist. It's how easily they can sit in the woods and be ignored once the work is done, as if the land itself decided to keep the secret. The pits soften, the trenches fill, the waste rock blends into the hillside, and the story becomes easy to overwrite with whatever explanation feels most comfortable. That's why the missing copper question has so much power. It creates a vacuum, and vacuums invite fantasies. A foreign fleet, a stolen treasure, a single dramatic answer that lets the problem stay simple. But if you follow the evidence without demanding a tidy ending, a different picture comes into view. The copper wasn't a one-time haul. It was a relationship between people and a material, sustained across long stretches of time. The mines point to organized labor. The tools point to learned technique. The spread of copper across distant regions points to movement and exchange, not an isolated pocket of activity. And the way copper lives and dies in the real world, wear, repair, recycling, loss, corrosion, explains why so much of it can vanish from the places we expect to find it, while still having shaped daily life for generations. The deeper lesson isn't about a lost civilization arriving from somewhere else. It's about how quickly many of us reach for an outside hero or an outside thief when we run into something impressive that doesn't fit an old stereotype. Because what this story keeps suggesting again and again is that indigenous communities in North America had the patience, the coordination, and the technical understanding to run a mining and working tradition on a scale that still surprises people today. Not in a flashy way, not in a way that leaves marble ruins, in a practical way, the way real capability often shows itself, in scars in the earth, in battered tools, in objects made to be used, and in networks of exchange that turn a regional resource into a continental material. And maybe that's why the legacy feels silent. It doesn't announce itself with a single monument you can't miss. It lives in patterns, where copper shows up far from its source, how it was shaped, how it was repaired, how it ended up in the ground. The copper didn't disappear into a myth. It disappeared into life. It became part of work and trade and ceremony and loss, then sank back into the continent in fragments and traces. If you stand at the edge of an old pit and imagine the sound of stone on rock, you can almost feel how much human attention it took to make that hole. That attention is the real inheritance here. The mystery isn't that the copper is hard to count now. The mystery is how long it took for so many people to notice what the ground has been saying all along. This was possible, and it was done, and it mattered. Thanks for watching. If you want more deep history like this, you know what to do. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.